So I did want to just warn you that I'm going to have to rush off to the airport right after I talk. So I'm sorry that I won't be able to stay around and talk, and also hear the other sessions, which I'd really like to hear. So I was asked to offer some reflections on the changing knowledge supply chain, and I tried to anticipate what would be in the talks and reflected, but also tried to absorb a lot and think about how some of the pieces fit together, not only what we just heard, but what I've been hearing over the past couple of days in meetings as well. And I was thinking about, to begin with, I was wondering, what does it even mean to talk about the transformation of the supply chain? And since I knew I was going to be surrounded by librarians, I figured I should just look in Wikipedia. So I found this definition: distribution of goods and services through a transnational global network to maximize profit and minimize waste. So what does that mean in the context of libraries and scholarship and data? So in thinking about that, I thought I would try to raise some of the big questions, but also offer some context about what we are reading about in the newspapers that you're all familiar with, but also approaching this as a scholar, because I'm a lifelong user of libraries, but not a librarian. So it is interesting to think, when we talk about this, what is the product? Who is the consumer? And if we think about the context of what we've been seeing in the news, the revelations of the last year, Cambridge Analytica, Facebook, et cetera, have certainly brought to the surface what we already knew in many ways, that we think that we are the consumer when we go on Google, but we actually are the product that is being sold. In some ways, you could say that's not so different from, say, the early days of television, when what was being sold was our attention, with basic demographic categories, that determine how much our attention was worth to advertisers. But now what's being sold is not only our attention, but also our data, ourselves, so to speak. So what does it mean? What does this mean for consumers and suppliers of information in the academic world, of scholarship, in the world of scholarly publication? I mean, one of the questions which keeps resonating for me in all these discussions is who owns the goods and services that circulate in this academic supply chain? And now we see, of course, that our information is being sold not only to advertisers, but also to the government. So the government is actually a consumer rather than a producer of data in this context. So it's clearly a moment of transformation, and just in listening to the discussions in the conference and in reading around in preparation for it, I'm also struck by the kind of shifts in our traditional vocabulary. So instead of talking about documents, we're talking about data. Instead of archives, access. We talk about collections, but we're talking about shared repositories, which are in both physical and virtual locations. So we're really experiencing a kind of radical shift in the producers and collectors of data, of documents, of source materials, and radical shifts in the business models that provide access to these. We've heard a lot about the commercialization and privatization of information, and in many ways this is transforming what we think of when we think about public records. And we think about that phrase, the office of record, and as I was thinking about that, decided to take a step up from Wikipedia and look to see how the Society for American Archivists defines it: the organization or administrative unit that is officially designated for the maintenance, preservation, and disposition of record copies. But we see today it's not at all clear who has responsibility to create, to maintain, to own, to provide access to records. In some ways, even the kind of, I'm not sure what the right word is, the kind of genre of the record is at stake here, where we're kind of entering into a world without archives, without records, without documents, when information just kind of goes direct to data sets, bypassing documents, so to speak. So what happens if data replace documents and records? So there's a problem of data and scholarship, but also, as we've seen, publication and preservation. And of course, you know, librarians know that 17th and 18th century book actually has a much longer shelf life, so to speak, than many of the new technologies, which are now obsolete. In Santa Barbara, we have this great wax cylinder collection music, and you know, how do you play that today? Much less, you know, CD-ROMs or other things like that. But then the other question that we see is what records are private? What records are actually public? What records are private? What should be private? What do we mean today when we talk about the public domain? And I would suggest that we're in a moment of, you know, if not just a kind of radical shift, but perhaps a kind of crisis in what we mean by private and public records. And this is happening, you know, at the time when the kind of office of record and the provider is sort of moving to a kind of acquisition access model at the same time. You all know, of course, that records are at the origins of the library and indeed at the origins of writing itself, and that the primal scene of libraries and the primal scene of writing and reading is also the primal scene of accounting. So in some ways, libraries and scholarship have their origins in business, in financial transactions, and indeed in government transactions. And, you know, if you think about taxes, that's the intersection of financial and government data as well. So thinking about some of these issues, particularly about public and private and about some of the questions we've been hearing today, I've also been thinking about my own work as a scholar of 18th century studies. And it's interesting hearing, you know, Sarah's account of how our scholarly publishers are moving into the kind of police surveillance business. I worked a lot on Diderot and Rousseau, and a lot of what we know about those French Enlightenment figures we actually know from police records, from the police state. So it's kind of quaint today for scholars to have access to that. I'm not suggesting that we should say, oh, those ICE records are good because eventually scholars will thank us or them. But in fact, a lot of what we know are from that kind of apparatus of surveillance. And indeed, in thinking about Diderot, after he was thrown into jail, because of those police records about what he was reading and writing, and he was stopped from publishing the Encyclopédie. Eventually, he was allowed to publish the Encyclopédie because there were so many investors who had a commercial financial investment and subscription in that publication coming out. So if it wasn't for that, maybe they never would have appeared. More importantly, I think the 18th century is a really interesting historical moment because there was a radical change at that time in our notions of public and private. And this coincided and indeed in some ways produced radical changes in literacy, in print, in publishing, in circulating libraries, in news media, in popular fiction, popular culture. So the rise of the newspaper and the rise of the novel is very much connected with this kind of moment. So on the one hand, you get a creation of civic community, creation of democratic culture, but it's also the moment when you have the invention of privacy. And in some ways, excuse me, in some ways, the kind of invention of our modern notion of the self, of individuality as well. And in many ways, the new technology of the novel and the autobiographical genre helped bring this about. Clarissa, locked in her closet, writing in danger of assault on her bodily person, was all made public in print to provide others access to her most intimate interiority. Which then taught others to even have an intimate interiority. So we have a kind of blurring of the boundaries of public and private, of the personal and the social, and a deep ambivalence at this moment. So I think that there's a lot that we can learn from the 18th century about the current transformational moment. And I don't say that to be reassuring, but I say it because I think it's important to have a kind of historical context for these kind of moments of cultural shifts, cultural transformations, which are also related to these technologies of reading, writing, publication, and access as well. And just to add another footnote from my perspective as a scholar, my most recent book is actually not an 18th century study, but it's a book I wrote called Forgetting Fathers, which is about my search for my long-lost great-grandfather, who was an immigrant Jewish tailor in New York City in the 1890s. And this is a personal story, but it's very much based on kind of archival research. And in some ways, it turned out to be about how we can recreate personal stories from public records, from government documents, from birth certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates, newspapers. And I also really relied upon and discovered an immense amount from published reports that were government documents, because the 1890s and the turn of the century, as many of you know, was this enormous moment of reform where the bureaucracy of the state was turned to try to bring about social justice and social reform. And there were these annual reports that basically showed the results of this enormous apparatus of bureaucratic inspection. So I really relied a lot on the annual report of the New York State Factory Inspector and the annual report of the Commission on Lunacy, the reports of every fire in New York City. I mean, I did a lot of actual old-fashioned archival research. I spent a lot of time in the archives of the Hebrew Orphan Asylum of New York, so I spent a lot of time in archives and libraries and such. But being a full-time administrator, I never would have been able to do this research, even over a period of years, without having Google Books. And in fact, it's one of those strange accidents of fate for me that, of course, as you know, what books went into Google Books? They had to be of the right size and shape to be scanned and not covered by any copyright. So it turns out that all that stuff that I found late at night was actually from the University of Michigan Library, from Princeton Library, from Harvard Library, and they had acquired, of course, every annual report of all of these things, as well as, of course, directories and things like that. And I could, download them in the privacy of my home. Not all of them, but at least I, then kind of knew what to go for. And at the same time, this was also a moment, because of this enormous kind of increase in genealogical research and family history, when Ancestrycom and all these commercial newspaper websites were mounting this massive effort to provide access to public records, but of course commercializing them and privatizing them at the same time. So I spent a lot of time finding things in the public domain, but I also then had to subscribe and pay money to get behind various firewalls. And in fact, ironically, once I did that, I found that when I actually wanted to not only quote from certain things in my book, but also to provide some of the kind of graphic images of what the documents looked like. And I did that, by the way, because I really wanted to try to convey to the reader the feel, the flavor of doing this kind of research with documents, the shape of the handwriting and the texture of the archives. So I found that even when I wanted to, for example, have a couple of small illustrations of New York Times articles that I found, that I couldn't afford to do it because even though the content was in the public domain, the graphic image was not. It probably wasn't as expensive as the Harvard and Amherst libraries charge for Emily Dickinson's manuscripts, if you want to quote lines from her poetry. But it was interesting to discover that commercialization at the kind of back end there. And it's kind of amazing how much information is available in these public reports. I mean, just to give you one example, I was doing a lot of research on insane asylums, as they were called. And if you wanted to know, I pulled an example here in the 14th annual report of the State Commission in Lunacy in New York. If you wanted to know between October 1st, 1901 and September 30th, 1902, how many pounds of sugar were consumed and what the average purchase price was and the annual per capita cost, you could know. I could tell you right now. So I mean, it's just amazing how many people did it take going out around New York State, getting all that information, and why were they compiling it, and what can we learn from it now? So I guess I have a lot of respect for data and for documents and for government offices. But now we're in this transformation in these business practices, the delivery systems, not just in libraries, of course, but in the scholarly publishing. So we have this shift from data, from publishers to data corporations to information conglomerates, as we've heard about, to the information industries. And we have companies that are selling access and proprietary tools and platforms. And as I was saying, we have this movement then of materials from the public domain to collections of collections which are behind paywalls and are in some ways potentially providing competition for libraries by providing direct access by subscription. So are these private goods or common goods? Is there a public sphere here? Is there a public domain that we can inhabit and lay claim to? And I mean, I think that between Derek and Sarah, we saw a lot of interesting examples about the role of the government here, where you got on the one hand neglect of records, indifference or benign or not so benign neglect, or you have suppression of records, or you have an abdication of the responsibility to provide records and to outsource them to commercial entities. The new director of the CIA was confirmed today. She, of course, caused a lot of controversy, not just for her torture program, but for destroying the records of the torture program. And a lot of this couldn't come out because the person who was in charge of declassifying the records was her. So there are a lot of interesting examples like that. We've also seen, the Center for Disease Control, is not allowed to provide any funding for scientific scholarly research on gun violence. So you could easily imagine these types that we've seen, of course, the EPA websites and things like that, but you can easily imagine then not only a neglect of records or a suppression of records, but or an outsourcing of records, but a kind of refusal to want to collect records in some areas. The examples that we saw in Africa are interesting too, because I think about the banality of evil and the bureaucracy of evil over the years. I mean, if history is the story told by the winners, archives are created by governments that expected to win or did win. And you think about the enormous bureaucracy of records that the Nazis kept. Clearly, they weren't worried about a war crimes tribunal. They were just doing a good job as their culture inspired them to do at that time, to keep records. Today, there's also another kind of secrecy, another kind of suppression of records as we look at the commercialization of data. Also in the news lately, a lot about NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. Well, putting aside former porn stars and Playboy models, we know, of course, that Facebook traffics in these. And it's not just that Facebook and other data corporations are hiring social scientists and scholars, competing with us for the best students coming out of graduate school. And I'm not just talking about the computer scientists, but I'm talking about the social scientists. But when they open their data to scholars, they have them sign NDAs so that not only can they not share the original scholarship, so you can't have peer review testing the scholarship, but you can't even say where you got it. You can't have a footnote saying from Facebook. So how do we imagine scholarship then in an era when data is secret and private and commercialized in these kinds of ways? And that's not even getting into the subject of Cambridge Analytica and the political uses and commercial uses of scholarship, not just of data, but of scholarship as well. And this relates to the question of who owns the data and how we can have an academic culture that has access to the foundational documents of scholarship. So I just wanted to offer just a couple more thoughts about looking ahead to the future. We're focused on open access. We're focused on scholarly publication, but the ground is shifting about scholarship itself. And I think that we need to be careful not to be fighting yesterday's battle at this kind of moment. There was a really interesting article in the New York Times either yesterday or the day before. Europe's data protection law is a big confusing mess. And the author, Alison Poole, was making the point that even though, the Europeans spent all this time trying to come up with principles, that the data practices upon which they're based are already obsolete because of machine learning and outdated assumptions about technology. So the ground is shifting even as we're trying to kind of come up with the terms to govern this. So one of my favorite quotes from Clark Kerr is, the great former president of the University of California. In his book, The Uses of the University, it was first published in 1982, but then he later, and it first published in 1963, but he revised it in 1982. And in 1982, he makes this really interesting observation. He says, there are 85 institutions in the Western world that have been in continuous existence since 1520. And 70 of those 85 institutions are universities. So what does that say? It could tell us that universities are very conservative and very resistant to change, or it could tell us that they have a great capacity for reinvention, a great ability to change from within. So I think that part of the danger for us now is always the danger for academic planning, is that we're planning for the past. And right now, even if we're planning for the present, we're looking in the wrong place. So how will the changes in the knowledge supply chain change knowledge itself, change the ways of knowing, and also change, what there is to be known. So how can libraries position themselves for both preservation and for innovation? How can we anticipate the changes in the academic landscape as well as changes in scholarly publication, changes in scholarship itself? How does the library define itself in that supply chain? We know that it has to be more than a consumer or a customer or a distributor, but if we're dealing in goods and services, and if we're dealing not in collections but in access to collections or licenses for collections, is there a danger of libraries being left out of the supply chain, bypassed by some of these other entities as we shift to a service economy from a product-based economy, as we shift to services and tools and platforms and subscriptions. And again, I think we have to always keep reminding our faculty to think who owns the scholarship in this supply chain. We also have to keep in mind in a moment that we're obsessed with data science, what the difference is between information and scholarship, between data sets and the analysis or the interpretation that creates scholarship. That is the method of research. So I think the challenge is how to engage at this moment, how to find partners. The SRC, which has been pretty forward-looking in all of this, recently announced a social data initiative where they're trying to come up with principles for the responsible use of social network data with peer review, and they're engaging with Facebook on this, although not, as I understand it, making a financial agreement with Facebook. And SAGE, I would suggest, has a very good tradition of helping to shape social science research in a way that's been, very it is very much in collaboration with academics. So where are the partners as we assert the relevance and the influence and the expertise of the library? And I think that part of this is really trying to define what kind of business the library is in. It's not really, I would suggest, in the information business. It has been for thousands of years a site for teaching and research and the transmission of knowledge. So what does that mean today? And whether that's a physical site, a virtual site, or another kind of portal, we need to find a way to sort of identify the crossroads that the library represents, whether it's for our students or our scholars or for the public as well. And I think that there again, we, more than I think anyone, have a great investment in that public sphere. So it's something that we have to help continually redefine and to reassert its value. So I will stop there, and thank you for your attention.
There's a marked difference between information and the transmission of knowledge. Would you care to amplify?
Well, I mean, I think that's what I was trying to suggest, at the end, that, data and information are at the foundation of scholarship in some ways, but they're not scholarship. And particularly as we see, that part of the future of scholarly publishing might be just the kind of publishing, so to speak, or the selling of access to data or data sets. That can be a great boon for scholars, but it's not the same as providing or publishing scholarship and creating scholarship out of that. So I think that's part of the kind of message that we have to get across as well, of what the difference is, because I do think, listen, we're at a moment when there's a huge misunderstanding about the very purpose of the university, where a liberal arts and sciences education is being reduced to vocational training, where people are talking about, replacing degrees with badges and certificates and things like that. So, I mean, we're dealing with a cultural moment where we're trying to assert the whole value of what it is we do in universities. So part of that is trying to kind of, reassert, but also perhaps redefine the role of the library. And I think the library has been surprised to find itself sort of at this nexus, sorry to use that word, of scholarly publishing and consumption, and the changes in scholarly publishing, which have kind of turned the business model of the library upside down. So it's a kind of interesting moment to try to figure out, how we intervene and not just be passive sort of observers or victims of all of that.
So an area of concern for me and interest is that maybe ties all of the talks together today to some extent, is that I don't think digitization of paper records is sufficient. In the case of your work in Uganda, keeping a drobo in a university, that just sounds so risky to me, and how do you balance the need for maintaining local control and this ability for people to in a community, in a government, to have that control without some sort of replication in case of some sort of disaster. And I think about the data planet examples and the data that goes in there, and I always worry about commercial entities and their commitment to preservation. What happens if their business model fails and there's no one to take over?
The CRL has been intervening in moments like that.
Yeah, but it's the print world is very different than this digital world, the born digital world, the digitized world, and so you replicate things, you have many copies, and how do we maintain trust in what we think has been archived and preserved, and bad actors who go in and modify that digital record?
Yeah,
we need provenance.
Right. No, I agree completely, and I think that that's that notion of the of public institutions and public good. I mean, obviously, there are a lot of private institutions like universities and libraries and museums, which also have that mission. But right, I mean, I don't know how many companies have been around in continuous existence since 1520, and I do think that there is this tremendous kind of. I was sort of joking about the problem of how you have preservation because of changing technologies, that what you thought was the most advanced technology now is illegible to you, and indeed there's much greater vulnerability with data records than with books. So I do think that thinking about preservation and continuity like that is really important for all those reasons, in terms of whether one has an interest to do it, whether it's a business, as well as the kind of technologies of it as well. So, that's part of the kind of value proposition that I think libraries need to make as well. But thank you, David. Okay, thank you.